Good morning, everyone. I hope that you and your families are safe and well. Thank you very much for joining the latest Owen Mitchell webinar. It's another fantastic opportunity to bring our clients, colleagues and communities together during some really difficult and challenging times. My name is David Withers and I'm a partner of Owen Mitchell, and I work in our serious injury team based in Sheffield, and I'll be hosting today's webinar entitled Living with a Traumatic Brain Injury, Behavioural Ripples Affecting Rehabilitation. We all know that supporting clients who have sustained a brain injury in maximising their rehab potential is a complex process, particularly if there is resistance or behavioural challenges. As our speakers will explain today, the reason for the resistance or the behavioural challenges is often complex and multifaceted. Skilled, intuitive and bespoke responses are required to avoid these issues from limiting progress, which, as you know, can affect adversely the litigation process, making it more time consuming and more complicated. In this webinar, our speakers are going to explore the challenges faced by those working with individuals with a traumatic brain injury, give guidance as to how to identify potential problems quickly, and provide practical solutions which are creative and bespoke to the individual, or can be made bespoke to the individual. Our speakers will be using a real-life case study to discuss the challenges which can be faced by practitioners working with those with acquired brain injury. I'd like to introduce our speakers before I pass over to them. So Bev Palmer is a behavioural specialist at Bush & Company. She has over 25 years worth of experience working with children, young adults and their families who present with behaviour that is challenging. She's worked in the home, at schools and in community settings, and Bev is able to identify clients' short and long-term behavioural support needs, primarily using goal attainment scaling and motivational interviewing techniques. Hilary Weatherall is a partner of Owen Mitchell. She also works in our serious injury team. She's based in Birmingham, where she leads a large team. She has lots of experience of resolving high value and complex cases in excess of £1 million. Her highest settlement to date was over £22 million on a particularly complex case, and Hilary is experienced in dealing with cases that have neurobehavioural challenges and components. She's a brain injury accredited member of APIL and she delivers annual training for them. She was also the lead solicitor for the case study that we will be discussing today. A little bit about housekeeping. I'd encourage you to ask questions as we go through the session. We'll endeavour to answer as many as possible at the end. If we can't respond to the question during the webinar, I'd encourage you to leave your email address so we can get back to you after the webinar has ended. The contact details will be available in the webinar, so if you want to get in touch with us directly, please feel free to do so. And thank you very much to those of you who submitted questions in advance, which is much appreciated. Our speakers will try to cover those questions during their talk. So I'll now pass over to Hilary to introduce the case study in a bit more detail.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Dave, for that great introduction. It's good to be with so many of you on what certainly in West Worcestershire is a very dreary, damp late October morning. So I hope we can make this session interesting and interactive, and that it will generate some further discussion both today and afterwards as well. Just by way of background, this was a case involving a mum and a daughter, both severely injured in a road traffic accident. They were hit by a vehicle that had been stolen by the defendant, and he had collided with them whilst they were crossing the road on their way home from school. Daughter was then aged 7. She sustained a life-changing brain injury and orthopaedic injuries. Mum sustained orthopaedic injuries and, as you can imagine, horrific PTSD. Initially, daughter's life was in danger, but she did pull through those initial few weeks and then went on to make truly incredible progress. She's one of those clients that will stay with me for many years in terms of remembering the progress that she made whilst I was lucky enough to be working with her, and then watching her progress now as she continues to be supported by our fab court protection team. The family were a close-knit family. There was an older brother, there was dad. Dad was litigation friend because obviously mum had her own claim for damages. There was a need for all professionals involved in the case, me included, to understand and appreciate a different cultural and belief system with the family, and we had the huge benefit, which I know is one of the questions that I think has already been raised and I'm sure will come up as we go through the case study, the huge benefit of liability being admitted in full, so interim payments of damages were readily available and were frequently made to us. She managed to return to mainstream school after her accident. She had a full MDT, but crucially very little professional care and support, as Mum was wanting to do all of this. She also progressed on to mainstream secondary school, but then some further decisions and challenges were coming to the fore, and the key decision was what was going to happen post 16 in terms of educational provision. That was a real turning point for the family as a whole, and particularly for her. And at that point, the team, as we will hear, experienced some of their most challenging times. And the solution was to bring Bev in to look at the resistance that was being experienced, the support that was needed to deal with the loss and adjustment that both she and the family were experiencing, and the transition on to college. So that's the background. Full credit to my colleagues Sarah Rees and Vin Jasingh, who were absolutely superb throughout this case. We ran it very much as a team case, as we would often do with this sort of case. And without further ado, I will hand over to Bev. I'll be chipping in every now and again just to aid discussion, but leave matters now with you, Bev.
Thank you. So hi everybody, welcome. Glad that you can be here with us today. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So as Hilary said, being able to litigate and case manage a client's medical legal claim becomes increasingly challenging when a client or their family unconsciously sabotage any attempt to provide supporting evidence of their needs. And in this case, this was one of the most profound things that was impacting on the ability to litigate. Sabotage can often be a lack of understanding and insight into the roles and responsibilities of those supporting, remembering that we have a parent who is recovering from her own injuries, is suffering with severe PTSD with having witnessed her daughter's injury, and a family that are now in shock and trauma and no longer performing in the way that they would normally perform. So PTSD, as I said, was impacting not just the client, but the wider family, which led to them just being stuck. And this stuckness lasted for quite a few years, which meant that they didn't follow up on appointments or clinical direction regarding the rehabilitation goals. They began making unreasonable demands for specific therapies. So this often happens, and I'm sure you're aware of it on cases that you work on, where sometimes if there's speech that is affected, families will demand speech therapy 4 times a week or physio 4 times a week. And in this instance, because of the orthopaedic injuries, that's what Mum particularly was demanding for her daughter. So families became excessive in controlling and redirecting, either consciously sabotaging or unconsciously sabotaging, and the MDT team began to get frustrated by all of this and were unable to support their client further. There's also litigation fatigue, the living in a goldfish bowl and feeling overwhelmed. Hilary, did you want to comment a little more on that?
Thanks, Bev. Yes, I will do just briefly. Just to say, this is inevitable, absolutely inevitable. Litigation is a horrendously long, drawn out and stressful process in every child traumatic brain injury case and in many other adult cases as well. So I think we just need to be realistic that this is going to be present, and it can manifest itself in a variety of different ways. So families describe being under constant scrutiny, not being able to have any privacy, having every decision that they make judged by others, questioned, queried or challenged. And the role, I think, for us as lawyers and litigators particularly, is to is to balance that. Expect it to happen. Don't be shocked when it does happen. Expect it to happen and work out the best way that you can look to support your clients and families if you're the lawyer through this process. But also talk to the MDT. They'll all be experiencing exactly the same thing, exactly the same experiences. And you need to think quite carefully about what you can do to minimise the impact of litigation fatigue. It is not easy and it will be present. But the point that I just wanted to make was that good lawyers have to be active listeners. They have to be continually innovative and creative and look at different ways of supporting clients and families. And don't just assume that this is the process that people have got to go through. We've just got to get to the end of it, and that will be that. Keep reacting, keep being curious, keep talking to the team and talking obviously to the client and family about what you can do to support them in a different way.
Thank you, Hilary. So there's also complex family dynamics and a pre-morbid history, and we know that the pre-morbid history isn't always accounted for in litigation and needn't be, but the reality is that people had lives before what happened to them, and often that pre-morbid picture contributes, particularly in terms of family dynamics and how they're going to cope and be resilient in addressing the challenges that they now face. There's also capacity issues, who has capacity, poor insight and high levels of resistance, to name but a few. Next slide, please. So the ripple effect, the impact and the challenge. So family claim versus client claim, how do we assess and manage this? Symbiosis, how is autonomy for our clients supported when the dependency is so high? And in this instance, we're seeing that this is a child. So the child, won't have capacity at that level, but will have some capacity to determine her own outcomes if her voice is being heard. We'll also have parallel processing. Who's mirroring who? How do we stay connected but not enmeshed? And these were all of the challenges that were being faced when I was instructed to come and work on the case. Rank and power issues, who's pulling the strings, who's in charge, and how is power shared and held legitimately. Psychological reenactments are quite powerful. This is the unconscious intention by the client or family to resolve the original trauma through their MDT team. So if the original trauma was about injustice, it was about not being heard, it was about being offended, then that gets reenacted in the MDT team, and the MDT team can be quite confused by this process as they're not sure really what's going on, but there is a complete block to engaging with therapies. And this process is a deeply unconscious process that is about resolving the original trauma. There's also a lot of scapegoating in teams. Who can I blame? And how do I make myself feel better? Scapegoating is about that ability to say, I don't want the problem over here. I want the problem to be over there so that I can start resolving it and somebody can start taking responsibility for it. Then there's the drama triangle, the victim, the persecutor and the rescuer. Where do we and our clients see ourselves in this triangle? And we'll go on to look at that in a little bit more detail. Capacity, who has it? Don't assume the litigation friend does, as that can often be complex when the litigation friend pulls rank on everybody and starts directing and challenging the therapies in place. Safeguarding or best interest decisions, when to act, how to minimise and manage the fallout. And certainly in this situation, DOLS was looked at several times in terms of the client's ability to make decisions for herself, to future think, plan her own life for herself. But again, that had to be considered with the cultural and ethnic background in which this client was brought up in. Stop, how to maintain movement by coming to a stop. We'll again look at that a little later on, and Hilary will have something to say about that. And then the seeking first to understand before being understood, which is a Stephen Covey model. And the funds, what availability is there for funds, because not all cases have the level of resources that this case had. Hilary, would you like to comment?
Thanks, Bev. Yes, just a couple of points I wanted to make on this slide. Firstly, the capacity of the litigation friend. This wasn't an issue, I stress that here, it wasn't an issue in this case. But what was very clear was that Dad, in taking on what is a huge and important role as litigation friend, was undoubtedly open to the influence of the family dynamics that were going on around him. The rules on litigation friends are quite clear. And the important point is that they have to be able to fairly and competently conduct the proceedings with no interests adverse to that of the child. Now, that is a lovely, easy legal phrase to use and to say and to repeat to people. But in reality and in practice, when you're dealing with a family with all these different dynamics going on, you'll need as a lawyer to keep a close eye on that and just make sure that that person who has that vital role is not coming under the influence of others in the family is really, really important. Sometimes, of course, you'll have far greater issues where you do actually have serious concerns about whether the litigation friend is able to fairly and competently conduct the proceedings. And I'd urge any of you, whether you're part of an MDT, whether you're part of a legal team, to just keep an eye on that and do raise those concerns with others working with this family. Almost certainly you won't be the only one that's noticed this, and it's a vital consideration that the lawyers have to have at the forefront of their mind throughout the case. The only other point I wanted to mention was the availability of funds in this case, which I said in the introduction. We were lucky, in inverted commas, it was a full liability case, so interim funds were available. If interim funds are not available or they are limited, you have to get creative. You have to talk to Bev, you have to talk to the other members of your MDT, and you have to work out what can be achieved, how much it is likely to cost, and what the end goal of spending, what limited funds you've got on that might be. Do the ends justify the means? If you're really without any funds at all, of course, as lawyers, you need to look at whether you can push the issue, whether by getting through the liability stage as quickly as you possibly can and then getting an interim payment, or alternatively, of course, many of you will be aware of being able to use the rehabilitation code in those circumstances. Back to you, Bev.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So the drama triangle is a model of dysfunctional and social interaction created by the psychotherapist Stephen Cartman. Each point on the triangle represents a common and ineffective response to conflict, one more likely to prolong disharmony than to end it. So, as you'll see with the triangle, there's the persecutor, the rescuer, and the victim. Now, we know that the mother and the daughter were real life victims. We're not talking about their injuries at this point, we're talking about becoming psychological victims as the process continues. And each player in this particular psychological game begins by assuming one of three archetypical roles: the victim, the persecutor, and the rescuer. Next slide, please. So victims are helpless and hopeless. They deny responsibility for their negative circumstances and deny possession of the power to change them, which is what happened in this instance. Mum constantly felt that she was being browbeaten, that she was being put under the microscope, that she was under incredible pressure, which with PTSD, that's exactly how it felt for her. But it may not be as it actually was, because she had an incredibly supportive MDT team around her. But they do less than 50%, won't take a stand, act very super sensitive, wanting kid glove treatment, and pretend impotence and incompetence. Next slide, please. The rescuers are constantly applying short-term repairs to a victim's problems, and this often can be the role of the case manager, that they unwittingly get drawn in to rescuing the family, while neglecting their own needs, and also while neglecting the fact that, you know, it's meant to be fact-based and clinically led-based. They're always working hard to help other people. They're harried and tired and often have physical complaints. They are usually angry underneath and may be a loud or quiet martyr in style, and they use guilt to get their way. So I want to make it clear that all of us can take these positions, whether we've had trauma or otherwise. This is a way of communicating in our everyday speak, and we can each take any one of those positions. But the drama triangle gets played out massively when you're in a situation as complex as medical legal cases, and particularly when people have been traumatized. So in this instance, mum took the victim position psychologically more than any other person within the family, and dad either stepped in to rescue or the team stepped in to rescue. Next one, please. The persecutors blamed the victims and criticised the enabling behaviour of the rescuers without providing guidance, assistance or solutions to the underlying problems. They are critical and unpleasant and good at finding fault. They often feel inadequate underneath. They control with threats, order and rigidity, and can be loud or quiet in style and sometimes be a bully. So in this instance, the team gets drawn into the drama triangle. The team began to complain that they couldn't get close enough to the daughter, they couldn't get to complete any therapy. Each session was being taken up by, if they were there for 2 hours to do a piece of therapy, an hour and a half of it would be taken up with mum. Mum constantly sharing how difficult life was for her, how difficult her child was, and that nobody fully understood. So in that instance, therapists were drawn into trying to settle mum, trying to support mum. But then if mum didn't get to hear what she wanted to hear, then the therapists became the persecutors. And so therefore everyone was against us. Next slide, please. Participants in a drama triangle create misery for themselves and others. This adds to the ripple effect and creates, in the long term, if unchecked, not just a ripple, but a full-on tsunami. And this is what happened in this case. We were going round and round in circles, and there was no transformation, there was no movement forward. And that is the goal, really, is to transform the lose-lose situation and create a more positive outcome for everyone. Next slide, please. So the winner's triangle, instead of becoming the rescuer, you become more assertive. You make clear what it is you're trying to say. Making that visual, keeping the word count down. You show care and empathy because that's important. We know that our families and our clients have been traumatized. We're not here to judge, but we are here to keep movement. And it's also okay for a client to be vulnerable rather than being in the victim position. And we would encourage that through honest dialogue, through empathizing, through listening to their stories and reframing their stories so that they shift in their psychological view from their distorted thinking to a more facts-based approach. Hilary, did you want to comment on the drama triangle?
Thanks, Bev. Yes, I will do so. Just really to flag to the lawyers in the audience, don't overlook this and think that this is just about the MDT and the family. We are all in this drama triangle every single day in our interactions with friends, family and colleagues. There's some really interesting articles out there and it's worth reading and understanding more about this. But it's really, really important that we maintain a crucial balance here. These are where you can demonstrate the very best examples of client care and client service, because you are getting the balance right, you're maintaining the professional boundaries and you're recognizing the dynamic that is going on. And the big thing for the lawyer is don't find yourself being dragged into any of those roles in the drama triangle. It is so instinctive, it is part of human nature. You want your clients and your families to like and respect you, but you need to maintain that boundary and not become part of any problem that is already bubbling under or is about to erupt within the family. So it's worthwhile spending a little bit of time just stepping back and reflecting. We all need time for ourselves in these cases to debrief, decompress. They are stressful, they are hard work, whatever role as a professional you have in the case, but guaranteed it won't be half as hard work as it is for the client and family. But do get your heads around this as lawyers, do think about it and reflect on the cases where you can see that this is at play, and decide how best you can manage those relationships going forward. Thanks, Beth.
Thank you, Hilary. So as we know with the drama triangle, it's a constant, so watch out for it. Watch out when you're becoming frustrated, that you hear that voice in your head that is very critical of your client, of the family, and then the collusion that goes on with that. So you might speak to therapists, and all therapists are in agreement because they too are feeling persecuted. So then that just increases the victim position and increases everybody getting stuck. So it's really important that you kind of read up on this, that you understand it, and note that those that are in a caring profession often as a default take the rescuing position. It's what they were born into, but it is a default position and can be quite damaging and long-term damaging. Next slide, please. So we've got the case study overview. Hilary, did you want to speak on this to begin with?
Thanks, Bev. Yes, just very briefly really, because I gave the introduction at the beginning, but just to highlight that Bev's intervention came at a relatively late stage into this case, but it was just another great example of the team collectively refocusing, thinking again, being creative, being innovative, working out what wasn't working and why it wasn't working, and looking at what could be done to move forward. What could we try that was going to be new? Bev, back to you.
Thank you. So as you can see here, that we have the client central, and the client should always remain central to the process. But what we had here was that there was a shift. The client didn't become central, the mum became central to everything. So we had to identify that. That was a crucial point in the case, was to identify that mum was creating a lot of barriers that were limiting progress and provision of evidence for the litigation team and for the therapists of being able to reach their goals. So we knew mum was suffering from PTSD, and Hilary was quite significant in making sure that mum got the support that she needed. But it's one thing to offer the support, but another thing for the parent to take up that support. And in this instance, mum dipped her toe in, but never really completed any full process of this. Mum protects her own fragile ego and perceived powerless position by defending, attacking and or avoiding. Many underlying psychological processes were at play here, and just a simple example was each time I went to ask her to sign my consent form, she would not sign it. And that became a reenactment. The signing of it meant she would have to take responsibility, and that if anything went wrong, it would be on her. And on her watch, on that day, she felt she let her daughter down. And so therefore, from the day forward, she wouldn't take any responsibility, even for signing a consent form. So mum is problem focused, she's hypersensitive to any change or challenge and requires high levels of emotional support. As I said further, she was taking up a lot of the therapist's time. She was helicopter parenting her daughter, resulting in the client becoming highly dependent, and as such the client did not trust herself or think herself capable, and there was no evidence at this point to suggest otherwise. So when I came on board, the client was highly resistant to moving to a specialist college. Bear in mind, as Hilary stated, she'd been in mainstream education, but now she was needing to go into a specialist college. The client was highly resistant, very emotional about this, and her lack of insight and awareness at the time, and her negative views of people with visible disabilities was highly contentious and prejudicial. And that related to a disinhibition, basically saying that, you know, I'm nothing like those people are, you know, there's nothing to them, they have no life, I don't want to be like any of them. So I was asked to join the team to address the resistance and to support loss and adjustment at this stage. Next slide, please. So, as David said in the intro, the considerations, they're multifaceted. The psychological support for parent is always a must. Always, when you're coming on cases, you're doing your INAs or you're doing any assessment, always ask what support has been offered previously. We always direct our parents to go to their GPs in the first instance, but mum, as I said, can constantly refuse to engage. We looked at family support. We offered psychoeducation. So we thought working with the family all together, including the brother, and modelling best practice. We did some reparenting because mum was unable at times to step in and parent effectively. But we did this in an empowering way. We were wanting to break symbiosis. Symbiosis is a natural process for children and their mothers. But what happens is when we get to a stage of autonomy and we begin to think and feel for ourselves and determine our own outcomes, the symbiosis gets broken. Sadly, for a lot of clients, particularly our younger clients, they go back into a strong symbiosis because of their level of dependency. And in this site, because there was a lack of insight and autonomy, that symbiosis was massively supported. We did individual work with the client, again, to increase insight and to provide evidence of their ability to break the symbiotic bond and the parallel process, because what happens if you have a highly anxious mother, the client parallels that same process and becomes highly anxious as well. Teams can also be drawn into that parallel process and become anxious about what they're actually doing and become de-skilled because of that. So when we worked with this client, after building trust with the parent, I eventually was able to take the client out of the house. And it was when we physically broke that symbiosis that we were able to engage the client to think for herself and begin to plan for her own future. So there was behavioural and psychological support for training for the MDT and the wider support team, so that they could understand the complex and multifaceted issues that were going on in this case. And sometimes there's a short-term pain for a long-term gain, supporting innovative and bespoke practices to break unhelpful dynamics. And sometimes that can be the challenge because you have to be creative, but have you got the clinical evidence to back that up? Valuing and accounting for the need for consultancy and supervision on complex cases to improve the outcomes. And in this instance, the case manager was exceptional in that she called the team together, invited everyone to have training so that everybody could be upskilled to understand the underlying processes on this case. And then we shifted from MDT to person-centered reviews. This maintained the client-centered approach. We've created photos and artwork, cookies and cakes that the client wanted, and we chose a setting that the client felt safe with and presented her journey through her therapy by putting images all around the room. This excited the client. She could see factually how she'd improved, and she was able to move forward and start to make some plans for her own future. Next slide, please. So consider other interventions. What might this look like? So Hilary and I was talking about what's the most important thing for our clients is contact. Contact before contract. Often we go for the contract. Can you sign my consent form? Right, this is what my job is. This is what I'm going to do. And actually having contact with the family is so much more important before you get that contract. Be clear of your role. What is your job? What are the goals? And make that as straightforward as possible. Use advanced empathy, seeking first to understand before being understood was the Covey model I adhere to. It accounts for the pre-morbid picture, but we're not distracted by it. But it also means we account for their religion, their ethnicity, their culture, and their family system. You know, this family system worked well before we came on board, and this family system now is dysfunctional primarily because of the trauma, but there were also some underlying issues there beforehand that we have to be mindful of and respectful of. Providing psychoeducation may need further support to upskill all those that are supporting your client to keep them on track, and must include siblings and other family members with influence. And I've listed there the papers that have been written to provide the evidence for that. Working with the wider MDT to identify any stuck processes, the scapegoating, the parallel processing, the projective process, and reenactments. Work with parents and the client's strengths, focusing on what they were doing well, and working towards the winner's triangle. Now, what I did was I'd take my flip chart in and I would draw out the drama triangle for them and ask them to choose which position they felt that they were in the most. And I would say that 90% of the time, the clients I've worked with are always honest, and they acknowledge how debilitating this drama triangle is for them. And they want change, they just don't know how to get that change. So it's important that not only do we educate ourselves, but we share that skill and upskill our clients and their families to be able to be empowered to make different choices for themselves. We consider intervention in other interventions, such as respite breaks for parents, siblings, or clients. Again, this supports the break in the symbiosis and supports autonomy. We reduced the amounts of words. We made things so much more visual, and we kept everybody, including the MDT, on track and focused on the goals by drawing them out and simplifying everything, because mum's complex PTSD meant she could not process information and was sabotaging every attempt to get support in place or even to achieve any goals. And then we set regular reviews to celebrate successes. And this is the key issue here, is one small success is massive. And this client particularly, she was a daredevil. She would love to get engaged in zip wire and climbing, and her whole body literally changed when she'd had that experience. So we focused in on those experiences and talked and heightened the experience so that the client was energized. And although she had memory difficulties that were quite profound, she never forgot those experiences because of the high level of emotional content that was attached to it, which was extremely positive. So that's really, really important. Is there anything there, Hilary, that you'd like to add?
Thanks, Bev. Just a couple of points. Yes, Bev won't mind me saying that probably about 10 years ago, most of us looked sideways at behavioural therapy, and it was an uphill struggle to convince defendants and the court that this sort of intervention was relevant, was needed, and ultimately should be awarded in damages. It's also a huge challenge to approach the defendant and say that these last two slides of what on any assessment will be expensive intervention should be paid for at this particular point in a long-running case. The role for us as lawyers is to persuade the defendant of, as Bev has said, short-term expense for long-term gain, because undoubtedly what was achieved here was a huge and immediate step forward for the claimant and family, but also a much longer-term, cheaper reliance on professional care and support. It exposed all sorts of other avenues for the client and family to take. It allowed them to consider other opportunities. It allowed them to consider different ways of thinking. But I think the initial reaction sometimes from defendant insurers, and indeed sometimes from the court, is this all looks extremely expensive, and isn't it what your MDT should already be doing? Have you got the wrong MDT? We're not paying for somebody to come along and retrain a fully qualified and fully trained team, and we're certainly not going to come along and pay for you to train the deputy and the lawyer. So various challenges put forward. I have to say, I think now things have changed slightly, but you need as lawyers to be ready to meet those challenges and ready to look ahead. That's the key thing for me. Look ahead and see, okay, what are the goals Bev or one of her colleagues is going to be setting here? What are we spending to achieve those goals? And what ultimately, it isn't just meeting the goal, i.e. she's been an experienced zip wire. What has that given her that will last for the rest of her adult life? And what skills can she take from that, and what experiences can she take from that and benefit going forward? So some really great examples of alternative interventions, innovative and creative thinking, and goes back to the point I made earlier. Our role in this as lawyers is key too. We need to get the money there, we need to be able to fund this, we need to be able to persuade the defendant insurer and the court of the merit in all of this. But when we can, the outcomes are absolutely second to none. The only other point I wanted to mention as well was this idea of the defendant paying effectively to provide therapy or intervention for dad or brother or any other member of the family or any of the other member of the MDT. Technically in law, of course, they're not obliged to pay for anything other than what the claimant needs. But again, this is about being creative and innovative. If they pay for that now, or if that money is used to pay for that now, what will that give to that entire family and that family dynamic moving forward? It will probably expose some of the key dependencies that have existed for a long, long time and would cost a lot of money in the future, and it may well reduce that cost in the long term. So a really great sort of pivot point, I suppose, in the case, and a big shift in focus, particularly the move from MDTs to person-centred approach. That for me, I will remember, certainly just from the point of view of reading through the documentation, was a key shift in focus for the team, and really great to see. Thanks, Beth.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So why might behavioural psychological support for families help? And I think Hilary has introduced this slide quite nicely. The specialist nature of behavioural work needs to be recognised and is often professional specific than profession specific. Delaying psychological, cognitive, behavioural and or emotional interventions often result in extremely complex presentations, families that are more exhausted and hopeless, and or increased mental health difficulties which slow down or hinder the litigation process. We've all had those clients where, you know, they've developed organic personality disorders based on their brain injuries. Mental health is so profound and needed to be supported throughout this process and can't be ignored. And what early intervention tells us is that it's potentially cheaper in the long run, it's less intrusive in the long run for the family, allows children to establish higher levels of skills before transitioning to adulthood. It addresses developmental needs. I have a client who is 32 now and injured at 12 years of age, but the developmental needs were never really addressed. So when I met him at 32, I'm effectively meeting a man-child who now needs to do the whole work on his developmental milestones so that we can progress him to his goals. And that's, you know, if that had been addressed sooner, there wouldn't have been as many problems as he's experiencing now. Underlying sabotaging processes can be checked out early, reducing the ripple and tsunami effect, and the scaffolding in place to support the family around the client, which reduces resistance, collapsing cases, and any unconscious sabotaging behaviour. You spot them earlier so that you can address them earlier, and then they don't get in the way of the process. Next slide, please. So the case study outcome is that Hilary and the team supported a week's residential at Centre Parks. This was put forward by the case manager and the team, and the client was taken away to Centre Parks for a whole week with therapists going and staying over with the client. The therapists interchanged throughout the week. Progress was measured pre and post using FinFam scores. Symbiosis was addressed and the clients encouraged to think for themselves. There was lots of evidence provided and a heavy focus on ability rather than disability. And the client began herself to refocus and take ownership of her own rehabilitation and showed pride in her achievements. And this was all filmed and lots of photographs taken, which were then added into the person-centred review. So the client's voice was now heard and the parent's voice separated. Both voices were valid and needed to be heard, but one more than the other needed to dictate the outcomes. Beyond the intervention, the client continues to progress. Litigators now have evidence of progress, and then the case settles. Future progress was hampered by transition into adult services. Litigation fatigue was acknowledged, and all therapies stopped. This was a suggestion I made alongside the team to pull back and withdraw so that this client could take a breath, the family could take a breath. And they did, and they had 3 months without any intervention, with the client being told that she could choose what she wanted moving forward. The client's now working part-time, learning to drive, and is about to start art therapy so that she can continue to find her voice, which was really, really important. Hilary, did you want to comment on that?
Thanks, Bev. Yes, just my final comment, really. The idea of the complete break in all therapy intervention I know to many of the lawyers in the audience will be oh gosh, is that a risk too great to run? But actually this was post-settlement, of course, and I think what it needs really careful management is if you're going to do this while the case is ongoing. But these days I think we've moved on from being concerned or nervous about that. Sometimes this is crucial for very obvious mental health reasons. Sometimes it's crucial really to expose the dependencies that have been created by a very busy, dynamic family and busy MDT. Sometimes it's necessary just because everybody is utterly exhausted and needs to take stock. I think managed carefully and appropriately, with, from my point of view at least, full communication to the defendant if I was doing it during a live pre-settlement case and explaining the reasons why, you shouldn't discount this. Defendants will seize on it as an opportunity to say, oh well, if it's all going to stop, they don't need it anyway, do they? No, that's not what it's about. It's about, as I've said, taking stock and revealing and allowing the family and the team to explore dependencies that have been created. So absolutely brilliant idea after settlement, no problem at all with that. Doesn't particularly concern me in the slightest. I just wanted to add a note of caution about doing that before a case had settled. But again, it's about being innovative, it's about being creative, and it's about looking long term. What is it that you're trying to achieve? And our clients and families deserve to have a break from time to time, as this process is probably the most stressful process they will ever have been through. Thanks, Bev.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So the top tips, if we quickly go through these, are to be mindful of not being pulled into the drama triangle, and I really encourage you to read up on that. Don't be part of scapegoating yourself. Watch if you become super critical of clients, parents or team members, or if you've become heavily problem focused on a case. Stop and think, is there a clinical rationale for any decision you're making and being made, or are you rescuing, persecuting or colluding with the victim's mentality? Are you over-identifying with the client, personal merging with professional, as that does happen? Check if any requests are relevant and or reasonable. Giving in to requests, no matter how well pleaded, for families can lead to increased challenges. And watch for parents and clients bypassing case managers and going straight to deputies, as that's quite common. See the value in getting appropriate psychological support for the family early, as this always increases rehabilitation outcomes, and you can look to papers that have been written around the scaffolding effect that the families need. Don't be afraid to think outside the box. Be open to suggestions being made by clinicians. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Others have been there before you. Next slide. Be mindful of professional boundaries. If you befriend, you lose legitimate professional power. Your clients and their families need your skills and professional support, your empathy, not your sympathy. When your work with the client ends, it does end. Otherwise, you could be pulled into offering free unsupervised advice and support, putting a drain on your resources and time. Take care of yourself, being mindful of the balance between task and process, building good peer and professional supervision on complex cases. This was one of the most complex cases I'd been on, and we offered each other peer supervision. And that was profound because we all learned and we were all able to break those challenges. Don't be afraid to have professional discussions like, where do we go from here? What does not work is just as important as what does work. And I learned that from what Hilary was saying. Be open to creative approaches. I've done bushcraft with clients, play therapy, creative arts, systemic working, centre parks, etc. Evidence and rationale can be provided to support recovery of costs, but it's about being creative and stepping out of that box. Be part of the solution and be able to recognise when you've become part of the problem, seeking alternative support where necessary. And timing is everything. Sometimes there will be a need for family support first before all other therapies can begin. Next slide, please. Hilary, did you want to conclude?
Thanks, Bev. Thanks, Bev. Brilliant to be able to discuss this case with you again. Just by way of conclusion, the case concluded and settled and was approved at the High Court just 3 years ago. I had to go back and check when it was. And it's wonderful. It's been a wonderful opportunity to go back and revisit some of the key issues that came out of this case and the massive turning point that we saw our lovely client experience following Bev's involvement here. She's done remarkably well. It was a hugely stressful process for everybody involved, but full credit to the team across the board. And it's been a great opportunity, I think, to revisit some of those issues that we now take forward and carry forward into so many of our cases by way of learning experiences. So thanks ever so much, Bev, for the opportunity. Really good to catch up on this case. And I think now I can hand back to Dave.
Thank you.
That's great. Well, firstly, thank you, Hilary and Bev. It was really informative and thorough talk. She managed to squeeze in a lot of content in a short space of time, so we're really grateful for that. I certainly experienced a drama triangle. It feels on a daily basis, raising a 2-year-old, living in a pandemic and trying to hold down a full-time job. So I found that particularly interesting from a personal perspective, and I'm certainly going to keep the winner's triangle in my mind for the rest of the week and hopefully beyond. I think just to summarise some of the key points before we move on to the questions which have helpfully been sent through, I think it's really important to take care of the family as well as the injured person, and consider whether family members need therapy to support the injured person, because brain injury, as we know, really does have a ripple effect. It can affect family and friends potentially more significantly than the injured person, who may lack insight. But also, that being said, we've got to bear in mind who's at the centre of the process. So it should always be the injured person that we're trying to help, and we're putting them in the middle of the process rather than a family member, the therapists or the legal team. And I think, as Hilary said, it's really important that the MDT keep an eye out for each other, including the lawyers, because it's really emotionally charged work. It can be really complicated, it can be very emotionally draining, but it can also be very rewarding. Good communication, clear goals, a consistent approach are key, as Bev said. I think don't be afraid, from a personal perspective, don't be afraid to try and fail, because rehabilitation very rarely works first time round. I think it's trial and error, which are key. I think it's unrealistic to expect it to work straight away. I think also make sure that the lawyers are involved in the MDT team, so there's a really joined up approach, which I think makes a big difference. So the litigation and the rehabilitation should be one of the same. There's a massive overlap there. They're related, very significantly so, and if they're working in isolation, there's more scope for problems to arise. And finally, I think one for the lawyers, it's really important that we promote rehabilitation at the earliest opportunity, as we do at Owen Mitchell, whether that be through persuading an insurer to part with funds at an early stage when liability is in dispute, or working to resolve liability as quickly as possible. We can then implement private therapy at a time when it makes the most difference. So I've just got a couple of questions to go through, and thank you very much to everyone who's contributed. Hilary, I'll come to you first, if that's all right. So the question is about acquired brain injury, and whether there are any statistics in respect of marital breakdown due to the stresses that arise in these situations.
Thanks, Dave. Yes, I think probably the best source of advice for statistics on marital breakdown is likely to be Headway. I know there have been plenty of articles published over the years in terms of the frequency with which marital breakdown occurs post brain injury. So that's the first place I would go to. I imagine many of the other brain injury charities hold similar statistics, and there'll be research papers out there too. We can look and see in our bank of resources if we hold any of those papers. I'm sure we do, because we collate quite a lot of what is available. And if the person who's asked the question wants to drop me an email, I can certainly put something together to direct them to a variety of other sources. But I think Headway certainly would be my first port of call, and then, as I say, the other support charities that are out there.
That's great, thank you. That's great, thanks very much, Hilary. And Bev, if I can come to you on the next question, please. An individual just wants to know how many hours you spent with the injured person who you were talking about in respect of the case study, and also whether the approach changed after the litigation had concluded. I think the concern is the family can take on more of the therapy roles at that point.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a really important question, actually, because the first intervention was for 3 months of work to really just engage the client in going to a specialist college when she was highly resistant. So one of my other key roles is I'm an emotional educator. And so I work on developing emotional intelligence and balancing that with a lack of insight and awareness. And so I did a lot of work with the client in just helping her understand her own challenges, but doing that in a supportive framework so that she was drip fed, if you like, what the challenges were, because she would become too overwhelmed if too much was given to her too soon. And with that, it was working with her weekly to begin with, and then working with the family, doing family work, and then weaning her off that process and carrying on to fortnightly work. And that work continued throughout until the case settled. And then we, of course, worked weaning off even more. One of the things I did do was go into her new workplace and did training for the whole team there. And did the transitioning to a vocational case manager so that the case manager could support her in the work environment. The family were then redirected for further support through statutory services, and I now sit back as a consultant on that case. I'm no longer involved actively, but I'm there as a consultant.
That's great. Thanks very much, Bev, and I'm afraid I've got another question, so I'm coming straight back to you, if that's all right. Really, there's two questions really with similar themes. It's about how best to engage with individuals with low insight and potentially anxiety and depression, and really the individual that's asked the question wants to know more about the timing of your involvement, whether there's an optimum time for you to get involved.
Yeah, thank you. Again, really good questions. I think what we've learned is that the earlier you can identify that there are going to be challenges regarding mental health, that the sooner you put the intervention in place. That might be statutory services, it might be clinical psychology, and it might be clinical neuropsychology in order to support increased insight and awareness. What I've often done on many of my cases is we have a clinical neuropsychologist that is there clinically leading the team, and I do the actual intervention, and we then do peer supervision to look at the goals and what our direction is going to be for the client. I think using motivational interview techniques works for clients who are highly resistant. You need to find a common ground with them. You need to find out an interest that's important to them. I worked recently with a client who was had got a room filled with DVDs, and I looked around this room and I thought, oh, that's my insight. That's my insight into him. And so that's the language I'm going to seek first to understand before being understood. And that's what I did. I spoke films for 3 or 4 of the sessions. So we had a common bond and a common language. And over then a period of 2 months, he gained increasing insight into the fact that his whole life was lived in a fantasy rather than a reality. And we needed to make the shift to the reality. And so a lack of insight sometimes can be emotional and avoidance rather than part of the brain injury itself. So it's about working that out. And trying to work with what you're being presented with. I will also make recommendations myself. I know that there's questions around the PTSD aspect, and that PTSD needs to be, assessed effectively by a clinician, and I will make referrals for that. Clients sometimes and/or their families may need EMDR, which is a specific treatment for PTSD. And again, we'll make those recommendations as part of our behavioural assessments. So it's not one therapist fix all, it's about a team approach, but at least having somebody on that team who is assessing those wider issues of mental health, particularly anxiety, because it massively impacts on cognitive functioning.
Thanks, Bev. And this may be a question that Hilary can answer first and then move to Bev, but if there are different therapists involved treating the family and the injured person, there's often a concern about trust, because the injured person may feel as though the therapist is mum's therapist or dad's therapist, for example. And Hilary, I don't know if you've come across that in the past on cases that you've been involved with, but how do you approach that issue? And Bev, after Hilary's commented, perhaps you could comment on how best you would go about dealing with a situation like that.
Yes, thanks, Dave. A really good question, and an answer that is not at all straightforward. You have to be obviously alive to these issues from the outset and think very carefully about what it's going to do, how it's going to affect the dynamic of a family by introducing multiple therapists treating individuals within that family. I think for me, however, front and centre of all of this is the client, and in this case we have the unusual situation, of course, of both mum and daughter being clients, albeit that mum's case settled sometime before daughter's. Those clients are your focus, are my focus as the lawyer, and certainly are the focus of the MDT. But what is the end goal going to be, and what do we need to do to educate those individuals as to why they each have different needs, and why suddenly this family unit that had been functioning perfectly well and perfectly happily for so many years before this accident had now effectively been blown apart, and each of them has unique and very different needs that can't be met by necessarily one and the same person. And I think it's an education point. It's not a legal point, say, for the funding issue. It's an education point, and it's something for the lawyers in the audience, again, to read around and think about, because you are the ones that are going to be having conversations with your clients and families around that to at least set the scene, and then with the right case manager and the right behavioural specialist such as Bev or one of her colleagues coming in to add the clinical flesh to the bones, if I can put it rather crudely in that way, because this is all about relationships and dynamics and family versus therapy. But the end point needs to justify what's being spent, and you also need to ensure that each of your clients in this situation understands why there are going to be different people coming to see different members of the family for discrete and different purposes. I hope that's a very long-winded way of answering what is a straightforward question. It's not a straightforward answer. Bev, I'm sure you've got more to add.
Yeah, I think what's important here, again, is to always have the view of what is safeguarding and what is best interest as well. So, you know, with large teams, and particularly with parents who are in the drama triangle, we can be talking about the mother and spending more time talking about the mother than we are about the client themselves. And what ensure that what the overarching view is there any safeguarding issues here, is what's in our client's best interest, and sometimes what's in the client's best interest is to find that support for the family. But I take the point that often we are free with our conversations, and we also have to think about confidentiality, what is written in our notes, what is spoken about at our meetings, what is on record, what is off record. And I think what was really profound on this case was how professional everybody was. Everybody absolutely was committed to making sure they were doing the very, very best. There are some outstanding individuals on this case, and I'm sure that on many cases you have similar, but nobody wanted to dumb down anybody. Everybody wanted this family to progress and to move forward, and they were identifying with their trauma and how they were stuck. So I think where we hold that is by being respectful, being empathic, boundaried, ensuring that we state beforehand what outcome it is we're actually looking for. So if we're going to have a conversation about our stuckness and where do we go from here, we're being honest about that. But the outcome we're looking for is to ensure that we all stay focused on our client and moving forward. Thanks, David.
That's great. Thank you very much, Bev, and that's a really good point to finish on, I think. So once again to Hilary and Bev for those fantastic and really insightful talks, and thank you also to everyone once again for joining us today. The session has been recorded, and the slides and the recording will be available if you want to share the recording with your colleagues please feel free to do so. And if I can encourage you to go onto our website, the Owen Mitchell website, you'll find details of our previous webinars and our upcoming webinars. And also, if you've got any ideas for talks, if you want us to present on any particular topic or even arrange for a presenter to talk about any particular issue, please let us know. Becky has sent on the Q&A a link to the feedback form. If I can encourage you to complete the feedback form, it would be really, really helpful. I know it's not the most exciting thing to do, but it does really help us tailor our approach to make sure that we're meeting what you want us to do. And it leaves me to say that I hope you enjoy the rest of your days, and thank you very much once again. Speak soon.